Good morning. Good morning. I was just at the Western District Conference delegate meeting, and it took about 5 minutes to get everyone quieted down. And I think if you would have had a gavel, actually, it would have taken a lot shorter, and I don't have a gavel here. But you did it within 30 seconds. That's great. Welcome. Last session in the July series, but it is the first of two with our Buhler Grade School principal, Melisa Kennedy, and I am excited to have her here and to talk about what the topic that she's going to talk about. It will be taking off. If you remember, I think it was last year, maybe the year before, we actually did an ACE score test, and we saw a video, and we tested, and we talked about trauma-informed care. Some of our teachers led that. This will be a continuation of that conversation. It's also a continuation of the conversation we had when we brought in David Case. I told you about a concerned group of people that have been gathering to talk about a Omega Project house in Buhler. And that group was meeting, and as that group was meeting, there were other roilings of the water in Buhler. People saying, "Wow, what if we brought brought more people to the table to talk about issues that are related to what you're talking about poverty in our community, poverty related to drug abuse or substance abuse, neglect, several other topics." Stories started coming out. The Buhler Foundation came and said, "Hey, we have some things we'd like to talk about." The school came and said, "Hey, look, these are some of the things we're talking about." Pastors in Partnership. And so, if you have this little blob that's talking about the Omega Project house, all of a sudden we have this larger group, and we're still calling it the blob. We're going to get a better name for it. And anyone's invited. The only drawback is we've been meeting at 7:30 in the morning. And so for some people that's a little early. But we have surrounded ourselves in conversation now with school teachers, with people from the Care Portal, which we're also connected to, from the mayor's office, Pastors in Partnership, and of course the Omega Project. And we're talking broader things, like what are some of the broader things we can do? And we've identified 3 responses. A long-term response, that's the response through the Omega Project House. An emergency response, like how do we respond to emergencies when someone needs a place to stay or needs funding. We have the Buhler Emergency Aid Fund, but we need a bigger network than that. And then we've also talked about how do we network all the things that are happening. And one of the images that often comes to mind to me when we do this is a missionary or an aid worker that came down to Bolivia when I was working with Mennonite Central Committee, and they wanted to check out the context and the work there. And they came back to give their report. They went back to Paraguay to give their report, and I listened to it. And he said, there is a lot of opportunity to work, and a lot of people are working, but everyone's sitting around their own fire cooking their own borscht. And that's sort of the image. And I think there are a lot of little fires where we're trying to cook our own borscht. What if we got a bigger pot and we all sat around the fire? We weren't reinventing the ingredients or the wheels and doing it together as a Buhler community. And there's some exciting things that will happen. So within that context, we invite guests from the Buhler blob. I see some guests in back here that don't normally meet with us or here. Within that context, we invite Melisa Kennedy to come speak to us as the principal. She speaks as a mother, as a grandmother, as an educator, as an administrator, and most of all, I think, a concerned Christian who believes that these are important things that we need to do to address the issues of our community. And she'll tell you more about her approach and the things she does. Melisa has served as the principal here for 3 years. Starting 3 years. And she has a story of how she got back into it after the sudden loss of her husband and needing to change careers. And she has been in education before, but then moved to Buhler and now serves here at the Buhler Grade School. And I think we are privileged to have her as principal. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you that you call us, that you unsettle us, that you don't just let us sort of be comfortable and smile and everything be whitewashed, that in fact you call us deeper into the messes and into the dirty, dark corners and into the places where your light just needs to be. And we thank you that you call us. And even though we feel like we don't have the gifts, you say, hey, just go. I gave you your mouth. I created you. I will gift you with what you need. And so, Lord, we're here, just like Moses was at the burning bush, to hear your call, to find out where it is that you want us to enter your work. And most of all, give us the assurance that you really will gift us with what is needed to do the work that you're calling us to do. Give Melisa the words to speak. Give us the ears to hear. We pray this in Christ's name. Amen. Give Melisa a warm welcome as she starts first of two.
Okay, well, first of all, I'm not used to this, so I'll try to adapt. I'm used to holding something or just talking really loud, so I'll try not to act like I'm holding something, or I'll try not to scream at you. As Wilmer said, my name is Melisa Kennedy. I'm entering my 27th year as an educator. I was a classroom teacher for 21 years in a town called Frankfurt. Anybody ever heard of Frankfurt? Oh, yay. I was there for a long time. My husband was a Frankfurt guy, and we got married and lived there. He worked for Union Pacific Railroad. I was a teacher. We had 3 children. Life was pretty grand. I'm going to fast forward just a little bit to the year 2015, because that is the year that changed my whole life. It changed the trajectory of my life. It changed my future. But it was a huge paradigm shift for me in my career and how I view things. On June 28th of 2015, my husband was actually working in McPherson. He worked for Union Pacific Railroad, and I don't know if you know that the high rail that goes through to the refinery. He was actually working on that. He was kind of in charge of all the signal operation and the construction of all that. And I got a call. He left for work that morning, and I got a call about around noon from his boss saying, hey, something has happened. Something happened with Mike. We're at the hospital. And so, of course, I headed out. They thought they were going to take him to Wichita. They ended up taking him to Salina. By the time I got to the hospital, he was already on a ventilator, and technically he was brain dead. He had a hemorrhagic stroke. He died. We decided I brought all my kids together, and we decided on that Tuesday, after getting the results of the MRI and the CT scan, that he was brain dead, and we removed him from life support July 1st. So he died July 1st at exactly noon. So that was trauma number 1 for me that year. It was a crazy year. And so everything changed in my life. What I was going to do for the rest of my life, how I was going to support myself. I still had 2 kids in college, and definitely as a public educator, I know I'm preaching to the choir. I wasn't the breadwinner of the family by any means. So, and we had just built a new home, and it changed everything. That August, he died in July. That August, my youngest is a son, and he proceeded to tell me, after me having no clue, that he was gay. Okay, whatever, because at that point I'd been through so many things that it's okay. He's a great kid. That fall, I went to a conference in Manhattan called the Kansas Safe Schools Conference. And there was a speaker there by the name of Jim Sporleader. Jim Sporleader is from Walla Walla, Washington. He was a principal at an alternative high school. And I don't know how many of you know what that means when I say alternative high school. That's where we send the kids that we don't want in our regular school. Okay? It's where we send the bad kids. And he took over that school, and while he was in that role, he was pretty traditional at first. Punish, out-of-school suspension, punish, in-school suspension, bad kids, right? Then he learned about something called the ACE study. And you have all, it sounds like most of you have heard about ACEs, which is Adverse Childhood Experiences. Anyway, to kind of go back just a little bit, I went to that conference, and It completely changed how I felt about what I did and about the kids that I've taught. And the hardest thing for me as I went through that whole experience was that I couldn't go back and I couldn't change the things that I had done as an educator for 21 years in the classroom. Because we were taught traditionally, you have good kids with good parents, and you have bad kids because they have bad parents. And it wasn't that I was a bad teacher, because I know I wasn't a bad teacher. It wasn't that I didn't build relationships with kids, because I did. But I didn't look deep down, and I didn't realize what in the world was going on in their life that brought them to where they were, that created the behaviors. Because we think that behaviors of a kid are a choice. We think, oh, they're just choosing to be bad. We don't realize that it's a response, it's a reaction to what's going on in their life. So let's talk just a little bit about trauma. And I want to talk a lot about also just where Buhler Grade School is, and I can't get my clicker to work, so hang on one second here. There we go. So what trauma is, and I think traditionally, and I know that it's different now, because now when we hear trauma, we know that we're talking about psychological trauma a lot of the time. But prior to me learning about ACEs, okay, here's the other part of 2015. November of that year, my children decided that, yes, we're going to decorate for Christmas just like we did when Dad was alive. That included a 12-foot Christmas tree. And that included Melisa standing on a ladder about 12 feet up. And I decided, okay, I'm going to get this done. It was the night before Thanksgiving. I'm going to do this. I'm going to have it over with. My one daughter was working. My two youngest that were in college decided to go to K-State to a volleyball game. And I had proceeded to climb up on the ladder and think I was going to get the tree decorated and be done. Well, I fell from the ladder. Not all the way, but part way. I broke my leg pretty severely, broke my tailbone, cracked a rib. It was just one more thing. Now, that's what I would have thought of as trauma before my paradigm shift occurred. Because it was trauma, let me tell you. I ended up having to go to Lincoln, Nebraska, having surgery. I was non-weight bearing for 8 weeks. So it was another part of 2015. But anyway, that's what I always thought of trauma. And now when I hear the word trauma, not that that doesn't exist, but it's outside of the education world for me right now. So we know that it's a deeply distressing or disturbing experience, and that doesn't mean it has to be physical. There's so much trauma internal in people, in kids, that we don't recognize or think about. And especially when I look at the second one. Shock, upheaval, distress, stress, strain, anguish, suffering, all of those things. So we talked about ACEs, and I know you did an ACE questionnaire before. And we know that the higher the ACE score, typically the more issues that our children have. So we started learning about ACEs, and when I went to that conference and I brought it back to my school district, then I was really excited because I was like, okay, I feel like something has clicked in my brain about our kiddos. And I knew that we had some kids that were having some real issues and traditionally had issues, and then I started really thinking about their lives and learning about them. So I thought, if I'm this excited about it, surely the entire staff of USD 380, I was a curriculum director at that time, is going to get it. And they're going to be just as excited as I am about what we can do for these kids. Now, Frankfurt, Centralia, the two schools in that district, are very, very similar to Buhler as far as a community. Not the size of the school, but the community itself. Guess how well received my theory was? Not very well received. We did a screening of the film Paper Tigers, which actually shows Jim Sporleader in that school and how he turned things around in that school and for those kids. I mean, and the thing is, I wasn't in a position at that time to really implement that change. And if the mind shift is not there and the mentality of looking at it from the lens of how can I help these kids, if that's not there, you can't force that paradigm shift on people. And I've definitely found that out through the course of the years that I've been working with trauma. But you can mentally tally ACE scores with kids often, and even with yourself. The thumbprint on the throat of many people is childhood trauma that goes unprocessed and unrecognized. Now, some people say, this has been happening forever. We have had kids with trauma forever, and they turned out just fine. That's not the case. Because we think they turned out just fine, but do you realize it's a perpetual cycle? Because how many of you raised your children the way you were raised? Same rules, the same structure in your household. It's a cycle. And poverty plays into that as well. So very quickly on the ACE study, it was done by Kaiser Permanente in San Diego way back through 1995 and 1997. It was done a long time ago. But the results of that study didn't really go anywhere for a long time. They just sat there. Jim Sporleader, that is definitely what turned his world around when he read this ACE study, and that's what changed his approach in working with kids in Walla Walla, Washington, in his school. And it all started in an obesity clinic. That's where he got the idea to do the study, because he was doing it, and he was doing weight loss surgery on women, and they were coming back, and they would be very successful, and pretty soon they'd gradually start gaining all their weight back, gaining all their weight back, gaining all their weight back. And he couldn't figure out what was going on, so they finally dug a little deeper, and they started questioning them. And they found out that the women who were gaining the weight back had been sexually abused. It came back. It was a preservation for them. Food was their comfort. Food kept them safe. And that was the catalyst for the ACE study. So food was their solution to help them through their trauma. So we know that the 10 areas of trauma are psychological abuse, physical abuse, sexual, emotional neglect, physical neglect, loss of a parent, the mother treated violently or vice versa, substance abuse, mental illness, criminal behavior in the household. Now, the funny thing about this study, and maybe you know this, so I'll try to be brief, but out of the people in this study, which there were 17,300, 75% were Caucasian. They were very much like you and I. 39% were college graduates, 36% had some college. They all had livable wages and health insurance. And they were all middle class or affluent, which is not typical of our community or any of the communities around us now. And what they found, and there's even like X-rays and MRIs to prove this, that children exposed to violence in their family show the same pattern of activity in their brains as soldiers exposed to combat. And we have a term for that, and it's called PTSD. And when we hear PTSD, the first thing that we think about are soldiers, right? Because that's traditionally what we've been told. It's not exclusive to soldiers. It's been around for a long time, and it affects our kids tremendously. I have PTSD of ladders, by the way, just so you know, because I was painting in the teacher break room, and it requires a lot of ladder work, and I don't like it. I'm very paranoid. So you think about trauma, and you think about how you protect yourself afterwards. I did the same thing with that. Or thinking about my son, because my husband had a stroke, and if my son gets a headache, he freaks out because of the trauma of losing his dad from a stroke. And he's like, if this is genetic, and so we all have those things that trigger us. So anyway, the ACE study also talked about, next week, this week I'm going to try to talk more about the school and what we're doing at Buhler Grade. But I want to talk just a little bit about poverty, because poverty definitely plays a role. And if you look at the right side of this, over on the left side, it talks about just the ages. And the purple is they've had one ACE, and the orange is 2 or more. And if you look over at the right, this is the poverty. Now, poverty level in this study is like $23,000. So $23,000 is the family poverty level. So below that is poverty, and above that is not. Now, this is old, so I'm sure it's changed. But if you look at the number of ACEs in children based on poverty, so where the 0 to 99%, look at the difference. And as you go to the 400% or more above the poverty level, you only have 17.4% with one adverse experience, 9.6 with 2 or more. So we know poverty plays a role in trauma. And I'm going to, because time is of the essence in this, so I want to talk just a little bit about childhood trauma and chronic disease. And I have a personal story very quickly to share with you about that. But we know that with ACEs, they have social, emotional, and cognitive impairment. They have health risk behaviors, drugs, alcohol, tobacco, all of those things. Adoption of or disease, disability, and social problems, and which can lead to early death. Now, there's a person called Gabriel Maté, and he is very well known and writes a lot about trauma and addiction. And he talks a lot about, there's a book called The Body Keeps the Score, and it's how we physically react to our internal traumas. And it's very good. So I want to talk just a little bit about another paradigm shift I had, and it was when I was reading this book called The Deepest Well, and it's by Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris. I was reading it last summer because I knew that Buhler Grade, we were going to fully implement trauma responsiveness in the school that coming year, which was last year. And I was reading this book, and it was talking about ACEs, and it was talking about how it affects your health, long-term health. And as I was reading it, they were talking about if you have an ACE score of, let me get to that, 3 or more, right here, you're 3 times more likely to experience academic failure, 5 times more likely to have attendance issues, and 6 times more likely to exhibit behavioral problems. But another statistic that was in there was with an ACE score of 6 or more, it takes an average of 20 years off your life. You die an average of 20 years sooner. And as I was reading that, I started thinking about my husband. Now, I want to tell you very briefly about my husband, and that is, he grew up in an alcoholic home, but his dad was the banker in a very small community. But he was also a raging alcoholic, and so was his mother. Now, do you suppose anybody in that town considered that there was any problems in the Kennedy household? They didn't. But he remembered waking up on Sunday mornings and making sure his dad hadn't passed out in the front yard because they were catty-corner from the Catholic Church and he didn't want people to see him there. He never got told, "I love you." He never got read to. His older sister was the caregiver. But that was all very internal. No one knew that. He had a lot of trauma in his life. So as I was reading this book, I was like, okay, he died at the age of 48. And out of the blue, so I called his sister that night. And I talked to her, and I said, I need you to help me with this. We went through the ACE study, and we found out, we went through the ACE questionnaire together, that he had an ACE score of 6. And one of them was hungry. I said, you weren't hungry. You guys had, it wasn't like money was a problem. And she said, Mom and Dad were out getting drunk. They didn't have time to go buy us food. So we think that we know by looking, but I just think that's a classic example of we cannot categorize. We cannot assume when we look at a family or when we look at kids and say, oh, they got name brand clothes on. Their hair's done. They're clean. It doesn't matter. Trauma happens at all demographics. So Buhler Grade decided to really take this on, and we started last year. And I'm happy that I have some Buhler Grade people here who have been an integral part of making that work at Buhler Grade. And I want to tell you, I am not the catalyst behind it working at Buhler Grade, and I see Norma back there too. It works so well there because of the people that were already there when I got there. That's why it works. A lot of the things that we're implementing in Buhler, they were already doing. There's something special about the family that has been created there, and I say this forever because I knew it when I walked in. It's different. And how we work with kids is different. And we really just took that approach and we made it broader and we brought everyone into it. And I feel like we've had great results. And so we know that, I would say that right now we're very trauma responsive at BGS. It's not what we do, it's who we are. I like to say that a lot because it's just the way that we roll there. And it's not exclusive to kids that we know have ACEs. It's for all kids. So we know that we want better behavior and academic success in our kids. And I want to this is so important, and I think this is going to apply even more to next week. as we talk about, we're really good as educators at helping kids. We're really good at helping kids that are with us on the spot that day while they're there with us. But we need to do more than just deal with them in that 8 hours. And that's a realization that comes to us as time goes by, because when I first started teaching, I never worried about that. But we're educating a whole child now much differently than we were before. Because honestly, we have made trauma responsiveness and dealing with kids' emotions and needs our priority. And when you do that, guess what falls into place? The academics do. They really do, if you make kids that priority. So this is the traditional approach that I had, and you probably grew up with as well. It was very punitive. It was that we are not going to worry about why you're behaving that way, but we're going to punish it. And we didn't give kids strategies to help them through it. And right away, starting in kindergarten even, we were labeling kids. Well, that kid's always in trouble, and so the next year teacher was like, yeah, I'm going to have that kid next year, and give me some pointers on what to do. It was never about what is causing this behavior, because there's always a cause. So, and part of this got cut off, but one of the things that we really focus on at Buhler Grade, and even I as an administrator, is that when I make a decision about what's happening with the kid, or what we're going to do with parents, or how we approach a problem, it's always going to be student-centered. We are always going to do what's best for kids. It's not going to be adult-centered. And when I say that, for example, if something happens with a student that is having misbehavior and they're disruptive in the classroom, we all know I'm not going to send that kid home, because it doesn't solve a problem. It doesn't fix it. We have to look at what's best for them. Because if we sent that kid home, who is benefiting? Only the adults, right? We're doing it because we don't want to mess with them right now, because we have other things to do. And what is that child gaining? And not only are they not learning when they're at home, we're labeling them automatically, not just with adults, but with their peers as well. So we started this, and it was definitely something that, like I said, I feel like that Buhler Grade was primed to really dive into this, but we did a lot of training, we did a lot of reading, and it wasn't that I forced reading on people, but I want to tell you that it's not just the teachers. It's the aides, it's the paras, it's the janitors, it's the cooks, it's the secretaries. It takes everybody to make it work. And we're very fortunate that everybody has that mentality. And I purchased some books. On a slide a little while back, I talked about 2 books in particular that were very important in my transformation and my shift, and that was Help for Billy and The Deepest Well. So what I did is, fortunately, I became friends with Dr. Sporleader, and he sent some money to the school for me to use however I needed, and I used that to buy those books for staff to check out. And I want to tell you, my aides and paras were probably some of the first ones to go in and grab those books. And the support staff in our school is as integral to making this work as the certified staff is. So it's definitely a whole school approach. But we know that caring adult relationships are the thing that our kids need the most. They need to be loved and accepted unconditionally. We definitely put relationships first and discipline second. And we've changed our mentality about what discipline looks like and when a kid misbehaves. Because instead of what's wrong with you, what has happened? How are you feeling? How are you feeling right now? And that approach is something that we do with all kids. It's not just the kids that we know have problems at school. We do it with everyone. And I'm going to give you an example. And I saw this last year because I was in Norma's classroom, actually. I know, she's going, don't talk about me. But I was just in there observing. I think they were having a class meeting, and they were talking about something. And I think it was about death, I think. I think you know what I'm talking about. And she had a student who, I don't know, were you talking about an animal dying?
We were talking about Mrs. French.
Oh, we were talking about Jara.
Fourth grade teacher.
Talking about Jara. Yeah, so that class is that's a whole trauma impacted class right there. And that particular class was fifth graders last year, and Norma was the teacher, and she started talking about it. And when you talk about something like that in the mind of a child, then my grandma died this summer. And tears started. And instead of, it was, Norma went over, rubbed his back, talked just a little bit to him about it, and continued the conversation, but he knew that she was there the entire time. It's those little things that make such a huge difference. And I know that I saw a difference in our kids this year in knowing that we were more relationship based. And if kids know they're not going to get sent home, do you know how much more honest they are with you? And if you say, I'm not going to call your mom, I'm not going to call your dad, they will be much more honest and open and not try to lie to you about it to get out of being in trouble if they know that you're actually responding to them out of care and concern. It makes a really big difference in our kids. And so we're really trying to build resilience in our kids and through those strong adult relationships. And a lot of that is just us responding versus reacting. And I'm going to give an example of myself, because this is what I think about when I think about kids that are in the fight, flight, or freeze, or when they're escalated. When I get angry, and I have a short fuse sometimes. If something makes me really upset, I have a short fuse. And the last thing that you want when you're upset is someone poking and prodding you saying, what's wrong? What do you need? What happened? What can I do? Because then you just need, right? Everybody needs space. But we, for some reason, traditionally have thought, even though we see that in ourselves, we traditionally think that we can do that to kids and it's going to be different. That we're going to poke and prod them and it's going to be different for them than it is for us as adults. It's the same way. It's even more escalated because they don't have those skills that we have to be able to calm ourselves down a little bit. Because sometimes I need 24 hours. I don't know about you, but if I get really upset, I know that the best thing for me to do is keep my mouth closed, go home and sleep on it, and address it the next day. But yet we think that we can put kids down, set them there, get in their face, and they're going to calm down by us doing that. It doesn't work. So we definitely, and these are the misconceptions, and I got this from I'm going to give credit to the person I got this from. It's James Moffat, and he was at Derby elementary school in Derby, and he definitely speaks a lot on trauma. And these are the misconceptions, because this is, I think, what prohibits the paradigm shift that I talk about. This is what stops people from really trying to invest themselves in being trauma responsive. And that is that there's no discipline, because we deal with misbehavior. We deal with it differently than we typically have before, but we deal with misbehavior. It's not like kids run wild. And trauma is not always linked to poverty. My husband is a prime example of that. That's why I like to share his story. And that because there are consequences, but the difference is we work through those consequences with the child. And the funny thing about that is when you do that and you put that power, you give them that power to decide what the consequence is, they will surprise you. They will say, well, yeah, I probably ought to stay in from recess. Or, yeah, I probably need to go back and pick up the mess that I made. Letting kids choose, of course, we don't say, yeah, well, we guide them, nudge them towards that, but we still let them come up with their own consequences, and we tie the consequence to the behavior. So if they were in an altercation at recess, then the consequence needs to deal with that time at recess. So maybe you're going to only play in this certain area and where we can supervise you more closely for a week. Or maybe you're going to play basketball in this spot for a week. Or whatever it may be. By tying the consequence to the behavior, it definitely has more impact. Because if something happens in the hallway and you're taking recess away, There's no connection between those two things. And it takes a while to get there. That's hard. Because we feel like there has to be a consequence, and there doesn't have to be. There is no rule that says there has to be a consequence. Where did we get that from? Like, when did we decide, well, we've got to show all the other kids. We have to set an example. Because if this kid got away with it, and we didn't do something for him, all the other kids are going to think it's okay to do that. They don't. They know it's not okay. Kids know what's right and what's wrong. And if they see somebody do something, they're not going to replicate it. In fact, we found that students are actually more supportive of one another versus the other way. We do have structure. Nothing's really changed in school. It's just the way we work with kids. It's the only thing that's really different. It's how we work with kids. And the academics suffer. And I want to tell you this, because this to me is a true testament to the staff at Buhler Grade. Because we have prioritized working with kids and with their trauma and with their emotional well-being. And we have found, and I'm going to brag just a little bit on them, because it would be easy to look from the outside and say that academics are going to suffer because we focus so much on what the kids, their emotional state, and not on their academics. But we got state assessment results back this spring. And Buhler Grade School had the highest scores they've had pretty much ever. So I think that, and the reason I'm going to say that because our teachers are working with our kids differently, but you know what else? Our kids feel safe and loved and accepted. And until they feel those things, they're not going to be active, engaged learners. And so I'm going to skip to this. First of all, fair isn't equal. And I saw this, I think it was in, whose classroom? I see it in a lot of classrooms, but I think it was it Greta's classroom I saw it in? And I also saw it in Jolene's. I think it was something that Buhler Grade kind of had talked about before I got there, that fair is not equal. Everybody needs different things. And this is probably the foundational piece of all of it, and it's the hierarchy of learning. And this is where I feel like we as a school community and as an overreaching community, and what I'll talk about next week, is the hierarchy of learning. And that is our most basic, before a kid, if you look at the very top, it talks about learning, creativity, problem solving. That's an engaged learner. The very top of that pyramid. That's the engaged learner that's attentive to what's going on in the classroom. They want to learn. They have the attention to do so. But in order to get there, we have to look at this pyramid. And some of the things that we expect kids to come in to our classroom every day and be an active, engaged learner. But then you look at what needs to be in place before they can be an active, engaged learner is this bottom part here. It's such a big thing. Breathing, free from hunger, thirst, rested. Basically, it's food, shelter, clothing. And I know that we all would like to think that all our kids come to school fed, from a nice warm home, clean, with clothes. That is not the case. And I think in order for this to have some impact, I need to share a couple things with you. We have had students come to our school that some are foster kiddos, some are not, but they all live in our community. We had a student come to us 2 years ago that had been, he's actually not in foster care anymore, and he's a student of Joe's this past year. It was a rough year because of some things that happened. But he was in foster care. But when he came to us, his mom had something called Munchausen's by proxy. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. But it's when the mom basically has a mental illness, and her gratification comes from the attention she gets from her children being sick, basically. This child had been in a wheelchair, he'd had a helmet, he had been on numerous medications, and came to us in foster care. Greta was here at the time. And Let me tell you, you want to talk about fight, flight, or freeze in a kid? He could tear, I called him the Tasmanian devil, because he could tear a room apart as a kindergartner in a matter of seconds. But we didn't. It really was a big shift for me as well, because we started learning about all the things that he had been through in his life. And then to top it all off, and this is the thing about kids in foster care, or kids in general, is that you might know that what they're living in isn't good for them, but that's their life. It's all they've ever known. And they love their parents. So for us to sit there and judge and say, well, they have a bad mom, that's their mom. That's their dad. We don't have the right to say it was good or bad or otherwise, because they love them. Even if it's the most dysfunctional house you've ever seen. Those are their parents. That is what they've grown up with, and they love them unconditionally. So not only did this child go through all of these mental issues and withdraw from all these medicines, he got pulled away from everything that was familiar in his life and put into foster care. And we expect them to come into the classroom and be an active, engaged learner. It doesn't happen. That is the very last thing on their mind. When we have a kid that comes to us that way, that's the very last thing on their mind. We have kids that come to us hungry. We have kids that come to us that stick French fries in their pocket at lunch so they can take them home to eat. And we'd like to think that doesn't happen in Buhler, but it happens everywhere, and we are not exempt. We have kids that are hungry. We have kids that don't go to the doctor. We have kids that don't go to the dentist. We have kids that are prescribed medicine, and they can't even fulfill. They run out because the parents steal the medicine and sell it. That happens in Buhler. And if it's happening here, I guarantee you it's happening everywhere. So this little kid that I was just talking about, the one that I called the Tasmanian devil, he's adorable. One of the hardest things that we witnessed this year is mom's rights were severed, and that meant he was basically put up for adoption. And, you know, he had a long list of issues. And he came to us one day, so he got put back into the system. He left the foster home, got put back into the system. And he came to school one day with a suitcase that had everything he owned in it, because they brought it there because they didn't know who was picking him up at the end of the day. He didn't know where he was going. That happens, and that was rough, because he was sitting out on the front porch on the front steps of the school at the end of the day with his suitcase. Of course, we were there with him. There were people sitting there with him waiting, wondering, who's going to pick me up today? Where am I going? Who am I going to be with? So where can we as a community reach out and help support kids that go through those things? Foster care is imminent in we need them so bad. We need foster parents, foster families so bad. We had another kid that came to us as a kindergartner this year, foster kid, and I had his foster parents come in. We had a meeting, and had the foster parents come in. I said, would you fill out an ACE questionnaire for this kid? And yeah, sure. So they did. Now this kid, when he came to us, we talk about fight, flight, or freeze. His was flight, and I'm telling you, he was fast. He was super fast. Much fast. It was like dodging in the hallway because he wanted to escape. He was pretty nonverbal. But it was the oldest he was 5 and the oldest of 5. Food was a trigger for him. So obviously we realized he probably didn't get fed very well. But anyway, as she filled out this questionnaire, she handed it back to me, and his ACE score out of 10 was a 9. And he's 5 years old. And she said, I don't know for sure. There's only one that I don't know for sure. But the rest of these I know for sure. A 9 at the age of 5. And we think he has been ripped from his mother and his family. He's dealt with all of this adversity in his life. And then we expect him to come to us and be ready to learn. It took, and I'm going to give kudos to my kindergarten teacher because she took him in and realized that she needed to spend time building a relationship with him before she was ever going to make any headway with him academically. And we do something called, like, it's kind of a buddy system. So, for example, she had an aide in her room, so when he escalated, she would go out in the hall with him and the aide would take over the class. Because we know that those relationships are the foundation of helping kids through this adversity. So this hierarchy of learning is very important to us, so we know that we need to meet their most basic needs. And we've been very lucky that the community helps us with a lot of that, as far as we send food home on Fridays with kids. We have lots of clothes that are donated to us. We have school supplies. We have snacks for kids when they need it. We also do this in our buildings called zones of regulation, where we have kids kind of check in to let us know when they come in the morning where they are. And our social worker also does this with kids. She goes to classrooms and teaches them about this, because you don't want a kid coming in and saying, well, I'm in the red zone with a smile on their face. They need to understand the behaviors and the emotions and the feelings behind each of those zones. So that's what we do, and I'm going to run out of time, so I want to kind of fast forward through this. But this is, I think, one of the most important things, and I know that my teachers do it, but it definitely impacts me every day as an educator. And how would I take care of this kid if it were my kid? And if you can't do that as an educator, honestly, you shouldn't be educating. Because if you can't put that child at the forefront of what you're doing and think about how you would, if you were their mother, how would you want them to be treated? We have to remember to do that all the time. So, this is so important for us, and it's just that empathy versus sympathy. And I didn't really think about these two things until probably the past few years. But we all say, oh, I feel so sorry for them. I have so much sympathy for them. Kids don't want your sympathy. Especially, and we'll talk about this more next week, people in poverty, they don't really want your sympathy. Because they get defensive. They're like, I can take care of myself. It's a pride thing. Empathy is different. Empathy is where you actually get down there beside someone and you try to put yourself in their shoes and you try to feel what they're feeling. And that is the difference that I see at Buhler Grade, and that is, I'm going to sit down here with you and we're going to have this conversation, and I'm not going to try to tell you how you should feel. I just want you to tell me how you feel. And I'm going to empathize with you and say, that has to be horrible. I can't imagine how you're feeling right now. If that happened to me, I would probably feel the same way. It's not, oh, you're going to be okay. Sympathy is, I'm so sorry. Gosh, it's got to be bad. It's not getting right down there with them and having that conversation. It's not looking down on kids, it's sitting with kids. And that's the difference that I see at Buhler also. So, these are the things that we feel are probably of the highest priority with us, and that is, we have to understand that the stress with kids is not, when kids react at school, it's because of something traditionally that happened at home. And we can find that out, because we can sit with a kid. I had a kid last year. It took 20 minutes for him to be able to even talk to me about what had happened that day. Or why he was in freeze mode. He wasn't going to talk. He just shut himself off. And he finally said, my mom kicked me this morning. So even though all these behaviors were happening in the classroom, it wasn't anything that had happened at school. He said, I didn't get stuff cleaned up, and Mom got mad at me, and I was sitting on the floor putting on my shoes, and she kicked me in the side. So now, traditionally, we would have not even cared or asked what happened. We would have punished for the behavior that occurred and not found out why that happened. Now, am I going to have a consequence for this kid who just informed me that his mom kicked him that morning because he didn't get the kitchen cleaned up fast enough when he had to make his own lunch? Fair is not equal, and every kid is an individual, and I feel like we've done a really good job of identifying that. We have safe places, not just in classrooms. We developed a calm room at Buhler Grade, and it's a place for kids to go to de-escalate. We've got big bean bags in there. We've got sensory things for them to work with. And we have found identifying triggers with kids. In other words, what sets them off. Like I told you, the one kiddo, food was a trigger for him. Kind of a hoarder of food because they don't know if they're going to have enough. So when they do get some, they go for it. So we have developed that, loving them unconditionally, listening to them as they talk about what's going on in their life, what's the cause of their behavior, and then just working with them, beside them, and helping them through it. And all of our teachers work on this with class meetings. They help kids identify that. But I have seen a tremendous difference. And like I said, the academics haven't suffered. If anything, they've escalated because of it. And I have like about another 2 hours worth of slides here that I would show you. But I ran out of time.
I have a PDF file of these slides. May I share it with anyone that asks? So if you didn't take these notes or you want to see what the other 2 hours are, I have...
At least?
Yeah, I have those slides. Wow, thank you. One of the things I think our group, when we first met with the first group, was this sort of feeling like, wow, teaching's a little bit different than just standing up front and teaching reading, writing, and arithmetic. It is a whole thing, a whole process every day. And I think one of the things, at least for me, when I see this, is to think of teachers are pastors in a lot of ways. And they need care as well if they're dealing with this. And this is incredibly creative, because if you've been a parent and you in the midst of stress try to think this way, it's not the first, your own fight, fear, and flight kicks in. And so it's amazing that we're seeing steps like this in our community. And I'd like to think that one of the reasons that the community, you found a receptive community, is that we are talking about these things not just in the walls of the school, but we are talking about them in Sunday schools. We're talking about them as people of faith, because that's who we want to be with other people. So hopefully that's the case. All right. That wraps it up for today. Come back next Sunday, and she will finish up the second part of her presentation. Let's give her a hand of thanks. And let's come back to worship at 10:30.